Panasonic have just announced a brand new camera in the Lumix G9ii, and it looks brilliant and it has some incredible new features that make this camera look very interesting and very tempting. Lumix have been making some big noise in the camera world recently and making people switch from the likes of Canon and Sony to the Lumix system because of the likes of the S5ii and the S5iiX. That's me included. I also switched to Lumix, first to the original Lumix S5 and then to the S5ii, which I'm shooting on now. I'm sure as well that the G9ii will have a similar impact in getting people to switch to the Lumix system, although it is slightly different because it is micro four thirds rather than full frame, but we'll talk more about micro four thirds in a little bit. I do just want to say as well very quickly that this video is not sponsored in any way, shape or form by Lumix or Panasonic. I'm not sponsored by them at all. I know I make a lot of videos about Lumix cameras, but that's just because I'm a big fan of their cameras and I use them every single day. So let's just fly through the main specs of the brand new G9ii. I have them listed in front of me right now because it has only just been released, but the main things we need to be looking at are it has a 25.2 megapixel sensor. It is a brand new sensor compared to the original G9, which had a 20 megapixel sensor. But one of the main things that we need to be looking at is the fact that it has the brand new phase detection autofocus that first debuted in the S5ii. Now the autofocus in the S5ii made a huge improvement over the likes of the original S5 because these had contrast based autofocus, whereas phase detect autofocus is much quicker, much more reliable, and it doesn't matter where you move, it's always gonna follow you around and latch onto you perfectly and track you perfectly well. And that technology is now in the micro four thirds system on the G9ii, and it is the first time that the G series cameras have had this level of autofocus because they have also been using contrast-based autofocus. It has 60 frames per second continuous shooting, which is just mind-boggling, but when you put it in electronic shutter, I believe it goes up to 75 frames per second. 8 stops of inbuilt image stabilization, which is more than the S5ii. The S5ii has incredible IBIS. The G9 has always been famous for its image stabilization, but 8 stops of image stabilization is incredible. And in the actual Lumix video where they announced the G9ii, they mentioned about it being able to make gimbals useless. So that just goes to show how good they are saying this image stabilization is. 8 stops is a hell of a lot of IS. 5.7K video up to 60 frames a second and 4K up to 120 frames a second. The S5ii, for example, will shoot 6K up to 30 frames a second, and you can shoot 4K up to 60 frames a second, but there is a crop in that 60 frames a second. I'm assuming because this is a micro four thirds camera that the 4K 120 will be the whole of the width of the sensor when you are shooting in 120. I don't see why it would be cropped. A few more specs just before we move on. It's got Vlog included, obviously. It's got a flippy screen. It's dust proof and splash proof. It's got real-time LUT, which we first saw on the Lumix S5ii, and it is great. I've made a video about using that in photography. And it's got an 8-direction joystick, which again came on the S5ii. It's also got a Leica monochrome picture profile, which is great if you're interested in shooting black and white photography. And as we know, Leica is very famous for its color science and its black and white photography. So to have that in a G9ii is that could be very useful if that's the sort of thing you are interested in. So the spec list of the G9ii does look very impressive, and if you have the original G9 or are already invested into the micro four thirds system, it is going to be a big leap forward and may be worth upgrading if you are interested in it. But should you invest in the G9ii if you aren't already interested in the micro four thirds system? Is it right for you? There's a few things you need to be aware of with a micro four thirds camera before you start thinking of buying one. And I've been doing some research because I've never used or owned a micro four thirds camera, but I didn't realize that they were first released in 2008 and they were the first sort of look at mirrorless cameras that we had, and they were introduced by Panasonic, Lumix and Olympus. And they were pretty much the first look into mirrorless cameras that we had and started that move away from the likes of DSLRs. A Micro Four Thirds sensor has a 2x crop factor when you compare it to a full frame sensor, and that's more than the likes of an APS-C sensor, which has a 1.6x crop. For example, if you were to put a 50mm lens onto a 4/3 sensor, then that is the equivalent of shooting at 100mm on a full frame sensor, which is just something to be aware of. However, it is very, very useful for the likes of wildlife photography, sports photography, which is where the likes of the G9ii are aimed. When you compare a Micro Four Thirds camera to a full frame camera, they have other benefits as well, in the sense that they are much smaller, much lighter, and the price. They are much cheaper than full frame cameras, and that applies for the lenses as well. They are so much more affordable, they are much smaller and much lighter. So if you are into your wildlife photography, for example, and you're going off on big hikes and you're shoving all of your gear into your bag, you want to be carrying as little weight on your back as you possibly can. That might be where a Micro Four Thirds camera comes in useful for you, because it's much smaller and lighter. And then you also have the added benefit of the 2x crop factor. So if you're shooting little birds, then you can get much closer than you will be able to with a full frame camera. Where you will start to see the benefits of a full frame camera is in the likes of low light and ISO performance, because they have a much bigger sensor, meaning that they can capture much more light. So in that sense, it's all about weighing up the pros and cons of shooting Micro Four Thirds and full frame and deciding which one is right for you. However, it might be that you shoot full frame and the likes of the S5ii and the S5iiX are your main cameras, but then a G9ii might be the perfect B camera, because of the benefits that that possesses as well, because they are brilliant for filmmaking. This G9ii has 4K 120, whereas the S5ii doesn't. That only shoots 120 in HD. So if you want something that shoots 4K 120, that might be the perfect B camera to go along with your S5ii. It's all about weighing up the pros and the cons of each one and finding out which one suits your needs best. On paper, the G9ii looks very, very impressive, and it looks a lot of fun to use. It's a camera that has caught my attention as something that I might like to shoot on, which is something I can't say for Micro Four Thirds in the past. This just looks a huge leap forward for the Micro Four Thirds system, and I think it will grab a lot of people's attention. A lot of people will buy into this. It has a few specs that outperform the likes of the S5ii and the S5iiX, and that is probably going to be a big reason for it. But I didn't mention this before, but you can record onto an SSD as well, like you can with the S5iiX. But yeah, it looks a lot of fun to use, and I haven't actually played with one. I would love to get my hands on one and play with it and compare it to the S5ii. So that is something that I might try and do in the future. But for now, that's it. It looks a great camera. I'm pretty excited by it. But let me know your thoughts in the comments about the G9ii. Is it something you're interested in? Are you going to be getting one when it is released in November? Or are you more interested in a full frame camera like the S5ii? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Come and say hello, and I shall see you in the next video.